Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. The website is aroundtheempire.com. This is listener-supported, independent media. Please pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Follow us on Twitter @aroundtheempire, and please help me build out the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Joe Emersberger joins us today from Canada. We talk about the latest failed coup in Venezuela, the sanctions causing tens of thousands of deaths, and the level of political support or resistance to the intervention in the US and in Europe. We also discuss Canada's foreign policy and involvement in the American and British empires. And lastly, we assess the risk of a larger war with Russia and China as they oppose American aggression and the sanctions in various parts of the world. Joe Emersberger is a Canadian engineer, the UNIFOR member with Ecuadorian roots. He writes for FAIR, Venezuela Analysis, Counterpunch, the Canary, MintPress News, Telesur English, and Znet. We recorded this on May 4th, 2019. Today we have Joe Emersberger speaking to us from Canada. Hello, Joe. Welcome to Around the Empire.
Hi, how are you?
Great. Thanks for taking some time out of your Saturday morning to talk with us. I really appreciate it.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Since this is the first time you've spoken to this audience, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I'm just an engineer from Canada. My roots are in Latin America, family roots. So I've always been interested in Latin American politics and in foreign policy in general. And I've in recent years written a lot about U.S. and Canadian foreign policy because they're so closely linked. You know, Canada, to a much larger extent than is understood, is really complicit in U.S. foreign policy, even when we're told that it's not the case. You know, like in Iraq, Canada officially was not part of the coalition of the willing, but it actually gave more material support to the war effort than the many countries that actually were officially part of that coalition. So. And a huge part of this is the media. You know, the way the media distorts our, people are much more vulnerable to misinformation when it comes to foreign policy. So, with the huge push over the last 20 years to demonize and delegitimize Venezuela's government, since Hugo Chavez got elected in '98, I've been writing a lot about that, but also about Ecuador and things going on in Ecuador recently as well. Because just in general, the media and foreign policy, but focused on recently in Venezuela and Ecuador.
Well, I have an engineering background myself. I was an engineer and I switched over to IT for most of my career. So we can call this a foreign policy with an engineer's perspective, from an engineer's perspective or something. But I'm also, very immersed in it myself. And I'm glad that you brought up Canada's role in this. And, Canada's kind of part of the empire, right? It's
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And particularly this intervention, this particular coup and long-term intervention in Venezuela, Canada's really, in some ways, seems even a little bit, at least as enthusiastic about overthrowing this government, if not even more than we are. Chrystia Freeland is your foreign minister, right?
Right.
And she's very enthusiastic about ousting this government.
Oh yeah, and it goes back, in 2004, February of 2004, a democratically elected president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was overthrown. In that case, it was a U.S. perpetrated coup, not even a U.S. backed coup. It was perpetrated by the U.S. The U.S. troops flew Aristide out of Haiti the early morning of February 29th, and Canadian troops were guarding the airport as that happened. And Canada was also deeply involved in the whole, for at least 3 or 4 years, there was a major push to delegitimize and demonize Aristide, and Canada was right in there with the United States in that push. And then afterwards, after the coup, like I said, they were involved in the actual kidnapping, and then they were involved in providing the troops and stuff for the occupation. That actually continues with the UN troops, but also just setting up the dictatorship that took after for 2 years. There was a direct dictatorship under this guy Gerard Latortue. So Canada was right in there helping all that, and the Canadian media as well. So it goes back. It's what Canada does. Even I mentioned Iraq, but even the Vietnam War. Again, Canada took a lot of vows saying they were against the war and all that, but actually they were helping the United States behind the scenes in very significant ways. In fact, it's kind of it's a pattern. It's a long pattern. It's not Trudeau's government is very like you say, very enthusiastic about this, and it's surprising to me only in the sense that Trump is such an incredibly racist, bigoted president. He's so ridiculous. He's so cynical. In the media has been willing to call him out on that, but in a very limited way. But all he has to say when it comes to Venezuela, suddenly everyone just jumps on board to an extent I've been surprised by. I thought it would inhibit them more.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Trudeau, I mean, pretty much he hates Trump. He makes no secret about it. And so do the so-called resistance over
Mhm.
here. And yet, when he's like, "Hey, let's bomb some country," they're all in.
Oh yeah, it just suddenly that all just goes away. It's very remarkable to
It is
me.
the
I
bizarre.
thought I thought it would be. I thought it would be more provide more of an inhibition, more of a deterrent to that attitude, but it hasn't at all. It just they just chug right along with with Bolton and Abrams and those guys
Oh,
just get recycled through. It's just like nobody's ever held accountable for the worst things they ever do, and it's I look at countries like Canada. They always provide cover for the when I mentioned Haiti, for example. At the time George W. Bush, he was at that time around the world, a very despised and discredited president,
yeah.
just like Trump is today. Because with even more reason, because of the Iraq War, which is such an amazing crime. But it was important, therefore, that Canada, and at that time also France. Those were two countries that were, on at least to appearances, to most people's appearances, very much opposed to the Iraq War. So it was very important that those countries jumped in Haiti and helped legitimize that whole coup. So the empire gets a lot of help. They get a lot of help from key allies, more than I think we often appreciate.
I think 9/11 was a turning point, but it's interesting that you brought up Vietnam. I didn't realize that Canada was so involved because I always think of Canada as the place that, people who were avoiding the draft ran to, and Canada
Right,
was very lenient in allowing them there.
right.
So I thought that was indicative of the country's foreign policy, but clearly not. Um,
No, there's an excellent book. If you ever get a chance to read it, it's called The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy by Yves Engler. It's very comprehensive. It's very well done, and it goes over all of this through. Canada was all the big empire support of the empire even before after World War II, the United States became the big empire, right? I mean, it was the
yeah,
biggest. But before that, Canada was basically doing the same thing, but for Britain. All the way back in the late 1800s in the Caribbean. Backing up, doing what it could to support Britain's imperialist ventures, and and of course Canada's own interests, banking interests. So they were always involved in doing this kind of dirty stuff for empire. It was the British Empire before, and then it became the U.S. Empire. But that's always what Canada's up to. So their whole reputation. I mean, it's important. I mean, it's a good thing that Canada did not join the coalition of the willing, let's say, in Iraq, or that it at least vocally opposed the Vietnam War. I mean, those things aren't trivial. It's not
no, that's
unimportant,
really important.
but it doesn't reflect what the whole story. Behind the scenes, Canada managed to make itself useful. Even things like, for example, Cuba. Canada has taken a stance towards Cuba, which is, well, it is important. It's not jumped in with the United States, really psycho campaign to destroy the Cuban as a country, but at the same time, Engler reveals in his book he's done also a lot of espionage and stuff for the United States as well. And used the fact that it has diplomatic relations with Cuba, and it's also kind of behind the scenes also done sneaky things to spy on them for the United States as well. So it's the full the full story is not what people think.
Yeah, almost like a good cop, bad cop role there.
Exactly,
Um,
exactly.
Now, just one more thing about Canada. An important factor in the Venezuelan coup. Well, first of all, we're not supposed to call it a coup, apparently. Being scolded on Twitter. It's not a coup. Don't call it a coup. And I'm like, just laughing at that.
Yeah, well, that all highlights how important it is that we call it what it is, by the way, because the more that people like that tell you not to, that's a good sign that, hey, we got to keep doing that.
Yeah, that's my attitude too. Um, but anyway, there's this thing called the LIMA Group. It's an acronym,
Right,
LIMA. I think it's a clever acronym because it makes it sound like it's a, very. It makes it sound like it's a Latin American led group. But
right.
my understanding is that that's Chrystia Freeland's project. Is that true?
I couldn't tell you if it's Krista Friedland's project, but it's definitely the right. I mean, the problem is, see, the right wing governments in the region, they have so much common interest,
Mm-hmm.
ideologically, that with the United States, and that it's hard to tell when people are actually being forced or when or they're just jumping in voluntarily. So it's hard to tell, how much actual coercion there is, if any, there is in all these kind of things. But
Yeah.
yeah, but the Lima Group was just set up because they couldn't get the votes they needed at the OAS to invoke the Democratic Charter and all. Because with the Democratic Charter, they would have been able to have more legal leverage for sanctions or what have you. And not that it mattered, because the United States doesn't care about acting legally or illegally. I mean, the sanctions they're imposing are just completely illegal, but it doesn't matter. They just do it, and just like invading countries and stuff. But they prefer to have some legal cover if they can, to kind of help legitimize just like they prefer to have allies go along, even if they're not crucial. I mean, they could pull things off without allies. Like in Haiti, they could kidnap the president without Canada's help, but it helps to have other people legitimize it. It helps with the whole propaganda campaign. So yeah, the Lima Group with all these right wing governments, it was just set up because they couldn't get the votes at the OAS. And now Venezuela is out of the OAS anyway. They started the process 2 years ago. It takes 2 years to withdraw.
Okay. Yeah. So let's just let's switch over a little bit
Mhm.
and let's do a brief recap. I think everyone who's listening to this pretty much knows what happened in Venezuela, but let's do just a brief recap of what happened this past week.
Well, yeah, what happened was it looked like Guaido, the self-declared Guaido was he's president of the National Assembly. I'll go back a little bit. He's president of the National Assembly because they had a deal with other political parties in the opposition to kind of rotate the presidency of the National Assembly. Now they won control legitimately of the National Assembly in 2015. I mean, there was a major economic crisis that's been going on since the end of 2014. Actually, you could say it started a little bit. The economy had trouble around beginning of 2013, right when Maduro was first elected. It ran into problems, but it didn't really go into recession until 2014, and then it just kept getting worse and worse, and became a major crisis. So they won control of the National Assembly. They finally had a big electoral victory. They got like 56% of the vote, and the opposition parties, and Chavismo, the group behind Maduro and Chavez, who passed away in 2013. They got that was their worst performance ever. They got like 41% of the vote or something. So they won control of the National Assembly, and then right away they started using that to try to overthrow the government. To block
Yeah.
the government's ability to deal with the economic crisis, and also to lobby foreign banks and foreign countries not to deal with Venezuela, not to give loans, not to deal with them at all, uh, and so they basically pursued right off the bat, and it was very open about this, that they're pursuing a policy of strangling the economy. So that led to a kind of a standoff with the Venezuelan government, and then to break the standoff, Maduro called for elections of a constituent assembly, of a constitutional assembly in 2017. So that provoked major, because the opposition said that was illegal, and well, it was under the Constitution. He is allowed to do that, and the Constitution is rather vague about whether he needs to really have a referendum to call it or not. So there are a lot of legal issues there, but bottom line, there's a major crisis, so he calls elections for a constituent assembly, and people said, well, he's bypassing the Congress, which isn't working with him, which was true. But at the same time, most countries in the world, under those conditions that Venezuela is under, they would have declared martial law. They wouldn't have they wouldn't have tried to elect a constituent assembly.
That's a good point.
So anyway, so he's so by the time, so that's how the Guaido was even in a position to be like president of the National Assembly. So it all goes back to that. So the National Assembly wasn't disbanded, but it was kind of bypassed through this Constituent Assembly, and so that what Guaido then did in January was he invoked Article 233 of the Constitution of Venezuela, which says that if the president abandons his post, that the president of the National Assembly becomes interim president. Now the problem with that is one few problem. One is obviously whatever you think of Maduro's putting aside his legitimacy, he didn't abandon his post. I mean, and even some opposition writers have said that this really doesn't apply. This really doesn't is not a good argument, even if you thought Maduro was illegitimate. But the fact is, Maduro did legitimately win the election in 2018. So the whole idea of Guaido being able to invoke Article 233 is just totally nuts. It makes no sense at all. And so, anyways, but he invoked that article saying he's interim president. Now, interim president lasts for 30 days, by the way. So even if you believe that argument, it'd be up. But then the United States says, well, no, that is suspended in time, as if the United States were the Supreme Court and makes rulings on these things,
Yeah, that's wild.
so anyway, so he's declared himself president, but the really important thing about him declaring himself president is that he got U.S. backing right away. And I was quite amazed by how many countries jumped in. They must have convinced a whole lot of countries in Europe that, mind you, it's a minority of the world's countries, but still, like something like 50 countries eventually recognized Guaido's claim, mainly the U.S. and its allies. So like the other 150 countries, whatever they are in the world, didn't. But the big club who thinks they get to tell everybody else what to do, they recognized him. So with that, what Trump went ahead and did then is he imposed basically an oil embargo, because what he said was that only Guaido's so-called government can invoice for U.S. Venezuelan oil sales to the United States. So what that means is, okay, the Venezuela can send the U.S. oil, but Guaido's so-called government are the ones who gets to charge for it, get the invoice for it. So it effectively blocks Venezuela's oil sales to the United States. So it intensifies sanctions that were already devastating. That Trump really made the sanctions much, much worse than Obama ever did in August of 2017. There's a paper that just came out by the Center for Economic and Policy Research. It was written by Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs, and they said the sanctions have definitely killed tens of thousands of people. Now, the number they put in the paper was 40,000. Now that's based on opposition sources who've tended to exaggerate mortality rates and stuff. So that might be high, but it could be, maybe it's 20,000. Who knows? Maybe, or
Yeah, I mean, if it's in the tens of thousands, then
it's in the way to see that, it's definitely has to be in somewhere in that order of magnitude. Is just look at the numbers for imports. When you have a country that used to be importing, like back in 2013, $2 billion worth of a year worth of medicines, and now in 2018 they imported like 140 million. So just a fraction of that. I mean, it's like a 90% or more than 90% reduction. I mean, that's just horrendous.
Yeah.
You just see that's just absolutely devastating. So anyway, I'm trying to get to last week.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Guaido, this is kind of just why Guaido's in this position, right? So he's got these absolutely, as of January, they've intensified the sanctions. He's got all this international support, and yet nothing's budging inside Venezuela itself. And the reason for that is Maduro got 6 million votes, and which roughly 32% of the electorate voted for him. That typically wins elections in the United States. I mean, Trump didn't get that. Trump didn't even win the popular vote. He got like 24% of the electorate.
Overall,
I'm talking of the electorate, not the vote, the electorate. In the UK and Canada, routinely, the people who win get like 30% of the electorate or less, and get these majority governments and stuff in parliament. I mean, just so his the turnout was low, because like the turnout was something like 42% in the 2018 election, but I mean, turnout in other elections in the region have been around that level as well. And there was Chile, there was Colombia, there was elections recently where, that was roughly the turnout. And, nobody's calling them illegitimate for it. Now, anyway, so So he's got all this. So Guaido's got the support. He's got intensified sanctions. He's all this thing, all this exterior support, but he doesn't have support internally. Now with now he's obviously they've got a hardcore base of the opposition, but it's not clear at all. Like when they always produce polls saying that they're so popular, but when it actually comes to elections, uh, you know, Guaido's faction was not, they won in 2015, but that was a much broader coalition that won. His hardcore right wing coalition, they were not dominating the vote at all. When they've actually run, they've not done very well. I mean, Falcone, who's a moderate opposition, Henry Falcone, who actually ran in the 2018 election, he got like 2 million votes. So there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of dubious polling out there claiming that they're popular, that they have support, and it just doesn't stand up. So anyway, so he doesn't have the support. He has support internationally, but it's pretty obvious he doesn't have support within the country. And what they've tried to do constantly is, and it's not just Guaido, it's the Bolton and Rubio and Pompeo, all these guys tweeting like maniacs. There's a chart that one opposition group put out of the tweets from the U.S. government officials. And what, like the week of the so-called aid stunt on February 23rd, it was like 150 tweets between the three or four of them. All directed at Venezuela. What they've been constantly trying to do is tell the military, hey, it's in your interest. You're openly telling them basically, hey, turn on Maduro, come on, we'll let you go. Or it's kind of alternating between incentives and threats, like do what's good. Yeah. So they're saying this openly to the military, and it just hasn't worked. They haven't turned on Maduro. Not yet at any point. At any rate, there's no sign that they want to turn on Maduro. And I think, again, why? Well, think about it. I mean, if you have 6 million people who voted for this government under these conditions, I mean, that's hardcore support. That's like, under these conditions, you have 30% support or whatever it is. That's hardcore support under these dire economic conditions. So what are they going to do? Are they going to take power, and these people are just going to, I mean, these in the opposition media, these people have been demonized as thugs and whatever, and there's a real possibility if you're going to take power by force, you're going to have to get control over a huge part of you're going to have to kill a lot of people, put it that way. So I don't think the military...
I mean, they understand what the alternative is. I think
right, exactly,
maybe better than most populations. They're under no, even the opposition figures will say, I've seen interviews with them saying, we don't want a military intervention. Because they know, I mean, first of all, the history in Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, the recent history of what the American military has done in other countries. So sure. It's hard to find any population that is under any illusion of mm-hmm. what life's going to be like if there's a military intervention.
Sure, and there could be a really long and bloody civil war. For many deaths. So you ask, people wonder why the military won't turn on Maduro. Well, I think they underestimate what lies astore, because if the actual military is going to be called upon to brutalize their own population for many years, I mean that kind of explains why they wouldn't be eager to jump at the task. For people overseas reading newspapers, it's they just turn the page. When it doesn't go well, when it turns out to a bloodbath, just like Iraq, they just turn the page, right? They just ignore it, pretend it's not happening. But it's not the case for the people who actually live there.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, so what happened recently was Guaido just made a last desperate, I don't know, last desperate, but certainly one of his, obviously getting desperate after all these months with nothing happening really, aside from calling for big marches. And so he decided with Leopoldo Lopez, the other guy who's part of his party, he's been in jail for a while for what he did in 2014 and before that. So they went and staged this video where they were standing with some military guys, and they were outside. The military Air Force base is in a wealthy part of Caracas, so they had access to it. They could go outside, stand outside with some troops, and say that they were launching, basically that the military is with them now and we're launching a rebellion. So they did that, and it was very quickly exposed as a total farce. I mean, there was a few dozen troops, and now they're I believe, in the Brazilian embassy seeking refuge. There were some other troops who there's a video showing. It looks very convincing too, where the troops say, "Hey, we were just told to come here. We didn't know what the hell's going on." These young troops in in a van, and they're explaining to their superiors that, hey, we didn't know what we were doing here. We were just told to come here, and then realize there's some kind of rebellion going on. So if you watch the video, it's very convincing. The guys are just telling them, like, look, we didn't know what the hell this is. And
So they really didn't defect at all, is what they're
yeah,
saying.
some of them were just kind of moved around. It was just part of the show. It was part of the
Yeah.
part of the facade. And like I say, if you watch the videos and listen to these troops explain what was happening, it doesn't sound like they're bullshitting, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the masked troops who stood there with Guaido, why were they masked if they felt confident that they were going to take over the country?
Yeah,
You would
sure.
think that they would have.
Yeah,
So either maybe they weren't really Venezuelan troops, or they were not very confident that they were going to be safe after this happened.
right. Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, I even thought to myself, well, like, did they just get some uniforms? I mean,
Yeah,
it's not totally unrealistic that they could get some troop. I mean, you can buy a handful of troops, convince a handful of troops anywhere. Um,
yeah. I heard that there were offers of tens of thousands of US dollars,
oh
which
yeah.
means
Hmm.
then you multiply that by I don't know what the exchange rate is, but it's huge. So
Hmm.
it's really a lot of money in bolivars. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. And so so it was pretty obvious within a few hours that this was going nowhere too, this latest stunt. And then it was basically, I mean, Leopoldo Lopez, who was, like I said, he's been a major opposition figure for a long time. He ends up running to the Chilean embassy, then over to the Spanish embassy, and it's a very weird situation there. And
But
then
who sprung Leopoldo Lopez out of cap? He was under house arrest.
well,
He
he's under house arrest, but I don't know. There's weird things going on. Like they've had people so-called quote unquote escape from like house arrest or arrest before. Like even during Chavez's time, some of the major coup perpetrators ended up uh, escaping from prison. There's this one union leader who was one of the guys behind the 2002 coup, Carlos Ortega. He escaped out of prison. Antonio Ledesma, he's another opposition leader. Somehow he got sprung. I can't remember if it was if it was out of house arrest or whatever. So sometimes you wonder, well, yeah, there might be people on the inside springing him, or maybe the government just sometimes prefers to have them out. Just says, okay, if they want to run outside, go run outside. Is that possible? A lot of things are possible. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's an article in Bloomberg called "Venezuela's Failed Uprising: How a Deal to Oust Maduro Unraveled." And just a couple paragraphs here. It says, maybe Venezuela's most famous political prisoner, Leopoldo Lopez, was the thread that unraveled it all. And then later they say, but it turns out that Lopez's first appearance in public in years might actually have had the opposite effect and helped doom a deal 2 months in the making. It was a surprise to some in the Maduro regime who had, after talks with the opposition, agreed to take part in a handover of power. They considered Lopez an unreliable hothead. Yeah,
Right.
I know. There's all kinds of stuff
Well,
mixed in with.
that doesn't make a lot of sense because,
Yeah,
I mean, first of all, Guaido is part of Leopoldo Lopez's party. So
aren't they both groomed here in the U.S.? Didn't they go to Ivy League schools? And
Lopez did for sure. Guaido went to the really opposition, the private university there. There's a few of them that are really very anti-government, have been forever. I don't know, but I'd have to look it up. I'm not sure how much time he spent in the U.S. training, but he was definitely groomed by that whole
yeah,
U.S. network. The NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, all those people who kind of provide the training for all the way back from 2007. Guaido was part of that
but he
student.
he he told reporters that he was freed from house arrest on Tuesday, and he'd been speaking for weeks with commanders, generals, representatives of different branches of the armed forces, and police.
Right,
So, I
yeah,
found that actually scared me more than anything else on that day when he showed up. But
right.
this article
Well,
saying that it actually it wrecked some negotiations they were having with the Maduro. So I don't even know what to believe in that sense there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very odd. You know, there's so many possibilities, but there's one thing that's going around. People are saying, well, what happened was that Padrino Lopez and some top guys, what they actually did was dupe them into thinking they had, oh yeah, sure, we'll do that, and then
Yeah,
and
that sounds more likely to me. But
yeah, but that to me, I don't have a hard time with that too, because I think if they were actually saying those kind of things, I think, well, first thing they do when they just tape it and just release it and say,
mm.
here's a tape of here's the audio of your top guys saying they're gonna
Oh yeah, of course
you know
they would as
yeah
proof.
yeah
Yeah.
right, they didn't really they didn't provide any evidence. My opinion, like this is speculation, but this fizzled so completely that obviously they didn't have whatever they thought they had. I mean, Padrino Lopez, all his top guys stood right by him, immediately said, this is a coup attempt, and we're behind the president, and we're not going to allow this. And so it was obvious they had no support. This fizzled miserably, and they just basically made fools of themselves. And now to the point where like Bolton and all these guys are going crazy, and they're ramping up the rhetoric about, which is very frightening, because that's a dangerous thing here. If the United States fails, we can't really celebrate, because we have what happens if the biggest gangster in the neighborhood gets humiliated. If somebody defies,
Exactly.
then, well, now he's got to reestablish his street cred. And how do you do that? Well, it's pretty frightening the way they do that, right?
Yeah, and
Uh,
these guys never give up. They
no,
just
no,
never give up. They
right.
always come back and try something else.
Well, because there's no opposition. There's no real opposition that holds them. Like I said, these guys, Bolton, Abrams, these guys should all be in jail. I mean, the fact that they're
Yeah.
not is just amazing. So, yeah. So I think what my opinion is that they probably, I mean, there's probably have to be like back channel discussions going on, and they probably just basically just blew whatever was, very minor things that were said about try to get negotiations or whatever. If there was any kind of remark, say, yeah, we'll negotiate, we'll see what happens. Who knows what can happen if we have negotiations down the road. We got to leave the, if any kind of vague remarks trying to get people to negotiate or get, start a process of dialogue, which is necessary. I mean, there is a real standoff, between opposing factions. It's been going on for decades, and the only solution that doesn't involve civil war is going to be some kind of negotiation, right? Some kind of cooling things down, right? So those discussions could be happening through back
Yeah.
channels, and then maybe they just blew it up and said, oh yeah, they're ready to get rid of Maduro. Just blew it up and then sold it to Bolton and those guys as, yeah, we got support. They probably figured maybe we'll make this last desperate a stunt to see if we can provoke something into happening. If not provoke the military into rebelling, maybe like with 2002, maybe we can get enough deaths or some kind of atrocities or something. Somebody will lose their head. Somebody will do something stupid, and maybe that'll provoke some kind of military intervention from abroad as well. That's another possibility, right? I mean,
Yeah, it looked like they were hoping that would happen on January 23rd. And again, as soon as there's any footage of Maduro's troops doing anything that looks violent toward the protesters, toward the opposition, that footage immediately gets out into the media and gets played over. I sampled some of the cable news coverage of this here, which is crazy, by the way.
yeah,
And they take this B-roll film and they just over and over they played this footage of some armored troop
right,
carriers, you know,
right.
running toward a group of protesters and running into them or whatever. So yeah,
Well,
they're definitely looking for anything that the Maduro to back up the rhetoric here is that Maduro is a brutal dictator.
right, and also the whole idea of even calling them protesters. If people were, if imagine if you got a bunch of guys to go up to a military base and start shooting at them in the United States, they wouldn't be calling them protesters, and they certainly wouldn't be.
No,
And I
they'd
don't
be domestic terrorists and
exactly.
traitors and
Exactly.
seditionists. Yeah.
Right. And never mind. I mean, just it's hard to even concoct a counter example, because it's too outrageous. It just wouldn't happen. But not only do they go fire on troops, but they're openly backed by a foreign power. Open
Yeah.
foreign governments applauding them for it, and shooting at troops. And then, like you mentioned the guy who got run over something by an armored personnel carrier. Under those situations, they're basically chasing. Those guys aren't protesters; they're armed insurgents, and that here, people wouldn't be, if anything, they'd be criticizing the military and the government for not, like, why are these guys even walking around? Why aren't all these guys just rounded up? Why
Yeah,
why are these guys even allowed to do anything? So yes, but with Maduro, the all the pressures the other way though for government. When the government's in the U.S. crosshairs, of course, any action, even in self-defense or to prevent a coup, is seen as illegitimate. And this is where the Democrats and others, they jump right on board. Even when they say they oppose. There was, I forget who this guy. I forget his name. But this guy, he one of the Democrats, he says, "Oh yeah, we're against intervention, but of course, they're always, but of course, Maduro's a or but of course, Maduro's a dick." They always reinforce the
that's
basic
prob
premise that makes all this possible.
that's probably my senator, Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. There are a few New Jersey politicians, one
Hmm.
senator and several congressmen from New Jersey, where there's a large Latin American, there's a large Cuban American
Hmm.
population here, a large Latin American, and just I'm not sure which country, but Spanish speaking population here. And I'm not, so the lobby is incredibly strong here. Other than the numbers in the population, I don't really know why. They always, they're always anti Cuba, they're always pro intervention. But yeah, he's been holding the line. He's actually calling for, he says the unilateral sanctions aren't strong enough and that we need to coerce our allies into backing the sanctions so that we have, broader sanctions and international sanctions, which, you know,
Right.
that
Well,
there's just so much irony in that. That's what's killing people, not Maduro.
right. And and actually the sanctions that Trump, I think one of the reasons they're getting frustrated, and like Bolton, and that gang, and think even more about, because they're actually running into the limits of what they can do with sanctions. Because,
Yeah.
for example, Trump just recently threatened Cuba with an embargo, with a, they already under embargo, but with an even more crazy embargo. And that's already gotten some pushback from the Europeans, because they have investments in Cuba. They have, Cuba, through its diplomacy over so many decades, has built up its own network, its own support. So it's not going to be easy for the United States to go even crazier with embargo. They're going to start splintering their own support among the Europeans, and that's not trivial for this. I mean, the states will do illegal things without the Europeans. Don't get me wrong, but it's not. They're kind of at the limit of what they could do. They've kind of done what they can do with sanctions. They can get worse, but they start running into problems if they start trying to make them crazier. Because they start antagonizing allies and stuff, and that'll also help lose them support domestically as well in the United States. So
And
uh,
it's just been for so long. And these sanctions are, I think it's very true what you just said. I think that we're using them, we're overusing them, abusing them, and that can only happen for so long before there's going to be, a resistance to that
right.
because it's interrupting trade, right? So it's always hurting someone.
Hmm.
Um, and I just don't know for how long they can keep doing this. And it's always what they resort to. They really want to use the guns, but there's a limit to what they can do with the guns. So they pull out the sanctions, and
Right.
it's just you could just see it starting to fail. In fact, it might fail, and I think it's going to backfire in a very big way. In that alternative banking transaction systems are in the works,
Right.
and people are finding plenty of ways to undermine the sanctions by
Mhm.
trading bilaterally in their own currencies. And
Right.
Cuba has a very clever way of trading medical services for other goods, things like that.
Hmm.
There's just no way you can just stop people from interacting and trading with each other
Yeah.
for a long term.
Oh, that's true. And also you know it's um it's uh, it's something they can it's something that they can keep doing, though, even if the failed sanctions, they can keep up a failed policy for a long time. That's my fear, though, is that even if things are um not working the way they want, but they can keep a failed policy like they did in Nicaragua. They didn't succeed in overthrowing the Sandinistas. But they destroyed the economy, and it was even worse back then because they actually had a Contra force, perpetrating terrorist attacks from across the Honduran border. Uh, and they were able to keep that up, and eventually they were able to get a so-called democratic victory in 1990, which, if you think about it, is just amazing that you look at that the U.S. backside won an election, but they won it on the backs of years of terrorism and economic sabotage. I mean, talk about electoral interference. I mean, they're going crazy in the United States about hacking of emails. Well, what if Russia had strangled your economy and supported terrorists to attack you, and then celebrates when, hey, our side wins because everyone's basically terrorized into voting for them. Say, hey, we want this to end, so we're going to vote for the side that Russia wants. It's just mind-boggling
Yeah,
that
yeah,
scene. So I think of that, and I think, well, maybe that's their, it's a failed policy, but maybe they can just keep it going long enough until something, you put the country under so much stress that eventually there's some kind of fracturing, some kind of uh, you know something happens that'll be to their liking. So
yeah,
there's really ugly possibilities there. But like you say, the hopeful possibility is that the United States is going so crazy with because it's not just Venezuela, it's Iran as well, where they're going crazy and trying to not just sanction the country itself, but then trying to even go after people who deal with them, who trade normally with them as well. So that's, you start brushing up against allies, like I said. So there's limitations there, and that's a very important point you brought up about possibly finally maybe the Chinese and the Russians and other India and others will realize that they have to really get serious about creating a financial system that isn't so dependent on the United States, because a lot of the damage the United States does is because their financial system is so large,
yeah,
so powerful. You know that all Venezuela's outstanding foreign currency bonds are governed by New York state law. It's when you have that kind of clout, financial clout, you can do a lot of damage. So yeah, there has to be. Hopefully, they'll get serious about. Hey, we need we need an alternative to this because these guys are nuts. We need something that we're not dependent on them. They don't have the opportunity to do this kind of damage.
yeah. So much control over them economically still. The thing that well, let me just go back to the actual coup attempt this time and the involvement of some of the Maduro government,
Hmm.
allegedly.
Right.
So initially, what I thought was, okay, this is a tactic. We've seen that. I think it's a well-known tactic in coups or in any regime you're trying to undermine. I hate to use the word regime because I'm not going along with that whole call our enemies regimes and call
Yeah.
everyone else,
Oh,
the
I
government.
I hate that word. I agree.
Yeah, so I'll say the Maduro government. So,
Mm.
what they're trying to do, and they've actually even kind of been open about this, is they're trying to convince Maduro that everyone around him is scheming and conspiring, is going to turn on him.
Right.
So I figured that they threw out those names there just to make Maduro paranoid that these men around him
Right.
had turned against him.
Right.
And but it then the story came out that no, they actually did give that impression, I assume through Lopez. So it's almost like Maduro was anticipating the Latin American governments in general, the left wing, they're very skilled in resistance to U.S. intervention, right? Because they've been through a lot.
Mm.
So what I figured when I found out that that Lopez actually did talk to, some members of Maduro's government, I thought, well, Maduro anticipated
Mm.
this tactic of, trying to make him paranoid, and actually did send some of his, like it was like an intelligence operation. He did
Right.
assign some of his maybe most loyal
Mm.
people to pretend that they were defecting when they
Mm.
really weren't. And then, this
Right.
further undermines the Lopez himself, who still has strong support from what I know, and Guaido, because they, despite whatever else happens, they have to try to undermine any credibility that these two guys have.
Right.
Um, so, I could see that playing out, but boy, that was weird. And apparently, from the news articles I'm reading, we still don't really understand what happened.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah. I'm not sure you know, unless somebody produces secret recordings, even recordings you can dispute because recordings can be tampered with. But unless you get something, some kind of hard evidence, we don't have anything. We have a lot. We have people saying things, but we don't really have, like I said, audio or video or anything like that. I know in the past, like even Guaido before Guaido even did his self-declaration in January,
Yeah.
was a video actually of him going to meet, going to meet with Diosdado Cabello.
Oh, right. He had a hood on his head. He was like trying
Yeah,
to hide. Yeah.
right, yeah. So you know that there are back channel discussions going on, and so there's all kinds of ways that people can say things that are misleading or take things that are said out of context, blow them up, and then try to present that to their supporters as that something that isn't true. So there's just so much stuff going on. But the
Yeah.
bottom line is if this that this the whole some of the stories that are put out just don't make sense. If they had that kind of support from the upper echelons of Maduro's military supporters, they'd be in by now. I mean, there's a story that's put out, for example, that they were all ready to go, but then they jumped the gun, and when they jumped the gun, therefore the supporters pulled back, and that's just silly. I mean, yeah, so we will support a coup on the May 1st, but no, you're going to do it the 29th? No way, we're not going to go with that. It doesn't make sense. And also, what was the other story that they came up with? There was another one.
Oh, where that Russia
Oh,
convinced
yeah.
Maduro not to leave. Yeah.
Oh, no, he's ready. It's like he's boarding the plane, but no, come back, don't go.
Yeah.
It's just cartoon stuff. I mean, just really silly stuff. Uh, it's obvious that then Maduro just to rub it in. And this is where it gets dangerous. Because Maduro, okay, he has his big march with Padrino Lopez, with all his guys, all those top military guys, and a whole bunch of troops. He's in there. They're all showing that they're loyal to him. And these are the guys who are supposedly, if West is saying, oh, that they're all against them, and they're just on the cusp of throwing them out, and we almost had them and all that kind of crap. And so when he does that and basically shows that it's all nonsense, then the danger is now you've embarrassed the great, now you've embarrassed the biggest gangster on the planet.
Yeah.
Now they got to establish their credibility, and then right away all of a sudden you hear this ramped up rhetoric about invasion and stuff, and you got to get these reports, and part of the embarrassment for them is when even the U.S. media starts saying that, well, they screwed up, starts calling them screw ups, starts saying that they were, hey, this is like Iraq, you guys didn't know what you were talking about, and so again they get embarrassed, and when you embarrass, a gangster, there's obviously very terrible things that can happen.
Yeah. And that embarrassment relayed into a big meeting at the Pentagon.
Right.
And so I wanted to tell you about there's one guy that I've been watching on this to try to get, because you can't get any real news from any reliable. There might be some in there, but you don't know what's some anonymous source just planting some information, and it's just completely unreliable, our media. So you have to rely on other ways.
Sure.
You have to get news from on the ground, but you also have to sort of learn how to analyze
Mm-hmm.
what certain people are saying based on their background.
Right.
So I'm going with Stavridis, Admiral Stavridis. He is the former, um, he led the Southern Command Southcom
Okay.
from 2006 to 2009. He's a major league hawk. He's hardly ever seen a war that he doesn't like.
Right.
And early on, some months ago, he warned, he said, look, I was the head of Southcom before. He's the one who, he did a lot of work preparing Colombia for being a military ally of ours. And he himself, even he was warning against any kind of military intervention. So I thought, all right, well, let's follow what Stavridis been saying. And he just said something on Thursday, May 2nd, in the Foreign Policy magazine. I'll just read you a little bit of it.
Sure.
He says he's still boosting, the opposition. He's not giving up, but then he issues harsh warnings against even thinking about military intervention. So he's maintaining that. Um, he's not caving in on that at all. So he said, but don't count Guaido out yet. According to retired U.S. Navy Admiral James Stavridis, who led the U.S. Southern Command from 2006 to 2009. Then, when he was asked if it was a failure, he said, this latest coup attempt was a failure. He said, I wouldn't characterize it as a failure at this point. I'd categorize it as a near miss on a success. From where we were a year ago, the trends continue to diminish the chances of Nicolas Maduro remaining in power. The country is spiraling. Damn, I'm having trouble this morning.
Mhm.
The country is spiraling downward. The opposition clearly has gained momentum in the strategic sense over the last year, and I, for one, find credible the reports that Maduro was about to fold. I think the Russians stiffened his spine, and I think the presence of thousands of Cuban military and intelligence personnel was decisive. I think that the nature of any high stakes political situation like this, when you insert human nature in the center of it, as in all of those senior Venezuelans, it becomes somewhat unpredictable. So you make bets. My advice would be to continue to bet on the opposition. Sooner or later, this regime is going to crumble. All of those senior people, again, I find the reports very credible, were wavering. They will waver again if they wavered once. Again, I think the long play is the smart play. And he says, with the caveat that this is entirely unpredictable, I will say that it will be months, not weeks, before the end of the Maduro regime. I think that the scene of action is shifting to Cuba. We have significant cards to play there. I think the next logical move for the Trump administration is applying pressure to Cuba, continuing to push the Russians back in a broader sense, and putting tactical pressure on Cuba.
Yeah.
So that's what he's
Right.
boosting up the rhetoric, the same rhetoric that we're hearing largely from Pompeo.
Mhm. Right.
But
Now, there's there's one important sense in which you could be, I mean, there's one important point he does make is that, the United States does have these incredibly devastating sanctions and they're going to keep applying them. So, the chances of the economy recovering, is pretty small. I mean, they're going to continue to do damage through sanctions. So that creates conditions in the background that could result in some kind of military coup or something happening.
I think they were playing the long game for
Yeah,
since the failed coup of Chavez. I
yeah,
think they shifted to long. Obama was definitely playing long game
yeah,
with the sanctions, and
right,
then Trump and Bolton were like, "Heck with that, let's just charge."
yeah,
Typical way
right,
the way Bolton
right,
wants to do everything.
right.
But
They
he
want,
does get asked later. He says, "What about military intervention?"
right,
He says, "Extremely unlikely, and I would not advise it. I
right,
commanded the Southern Command for 3 years in Miami, so I can picture pretty much what's happening there. They are
right,
working very hard on a wide variety of contingency plans that runs from increased and intense surveillance to preparation for humanitarian exodus to working with regional partners on both of those elements. The
right,
most aggressive contingency plan they are looking at would be one that would protect American citizens if for some reason there was a backlash against them. That would be the only circumstance in which I could see a U.S. troop presence. There are probably close to 100,000 American citizens in Venezuela, so Maduro would be very well advised to avoid any kind of program that harassed the blah, blah, blah American citizens. But he is maintaining, because what he said before,
mhm,
some months ago, is that even our allies in Latin America would turn on us if we did a military intervention. And I was encouraged to see that he's still taking
yeah,
that stance. Now, because you always have to think he could be just flat out lying because one, they don't want Trump to think, Trump's making them promise they won't start a new war. Plus, they are extremely paranoid about the anti-interventionist bent that a large percentage of Americans have.
mhm.
Um, so he could just be playing it all down. But I think he's serious in this advice. Don't invade the place.
Yeah. I think they don't want to invade. They'd rather just have sanctions cause the government to crumble and have their people get in. Definitely, that's their preference. But the problem with Bolton and that gang is that they want immediate results, and whereas the Democrats like you say, Obama, those guys, they prefer to play it slower, and it's also illegal. It's also inhuman and everything else. But they're more cautious criminals. They want to do things in a sneakier way, not alienate as many allies. So that's basically the difference. It's a tactical thing. It's not a principle thing, and that's the problem. That's why guys like Bolton, Abrams, they have nothing to fear in terms of legal consequences for all the horrendous things they've done, or Trump, or any of them, or Obama for that matter. They can just keep covering each other's rear ends, and never prosecute anybody for anything, and so so they can just. Oh, we end up with these debates about what kind of criminality do you prefer? Do you prefer very slow, cautious criminals, or you prefer more, impetuous, crazy criminals like Bolton and those guys? So,
Yeah,
uh,
but Bolton is he's a wild card, and the other thing you have to consider here is that he could try to obey a pigs type situation. It's depending on is backing, who's in his camp. He's got his own allies there in the National Security Council.
right,
Um, but the other thing is that we don't have a confirmed Secretary of Defense. We don't have a Homeland Security, Secretary of Homeland Security. And the State Department, you got Elliot Abrams in there
right,
and Pompeo. So the people who could actually make this happen, I don't find them to be very reliable. I mean, we're basically relying on, I don't know, the Joint Chiefs and some people in the Pentagon keeping this happening.
right,
And Trump, I don't think Trump would agree to an outright military invasion, but they can still do things, triggering events, false flag type things.
right.
Um, and that's not conspiracy theory. Like a lot of our wars were started from false flags, so people need to understand that.
Right.
So I still think that even though this guy, a war hawk himself, is saying don't do it, we've still got some really dangerous wild cards in the mix here. So
For sure. And
yeah,
what they're doing right now is murderous as well. I know invasion is definitely the ultimate crime, and it's important that people oppose it. But what we really need is in our countries, in yours and mine, and Western, we need a real anti-imperialist movement, a movement that say, yeah, we don't want to invade, we don't want you meddling. Period. You guys are not a force for good. You guys aren't judge, jury, and executioner of which governments are proper democracies and which aren't. Straighten out your own crap, put your criminals in jail, and that should be where your focus is. We don't have a movement strong enough. So my hope personally is that is in Russia and China, unfortunately, that they can other countries like that for their own interests, they don't want the United States running around acting like a lunatic. So they're gonna say, look, Venezuela, okay, it's maybe not the most strategically important. Well, given its wealth, it's probably important, but it's more important for them to basically hold the line and say, look, if we let them destroy Venezuela, they're coming. They're just going to keep going.
yeah,
It's
exactly.
like the idea with Iraq wasn't just Iraq. The idea with Iraq was to invade Iraq and go on to Iran, right? Uh,
Yeah, with Venezuela, that's just part of a larger plan too. It's having governments that are friendly and compliant
yeah,
through the whole continent, right?
right. And so yeah, they if they so quote unquote succeed in Venezuela, they'll just keep going. So hopefully that I think the Russians and the Chinese are going to get more serious, and well, they are opposing them, but hopefully they'll do even more. To say, okay, this is crazy. These guys if we let them keep doing this, they're just going to keep getting more and more aggressive. Even with, they have sanctions on Russia, they have sanctions on China, they have sanctions on Iran. I mean, they're just acting like mad people over there, and they think they rule the world, and that everyone's just got to do what they say. So hopefully they'll get more pushback from those other countries, because I would like to have an anti-imperialist movement in our own democracies to push back, but I mean it's there, but it's marginal, and it's not. I don't think it's strong enough to be as powerful as we need it to be to really hold these guys back. At best, we might prevent military intervention, which is important, but there's so many other options they have to destroy countries that don't involve military intervention. I mean, if you look at Guatemala, Chile, all the horrible things they've done in Latin America, a lot of that didn't involve military intervention per se. It was usually just support, material support for their accomplices to do what they wanted,
Yeah, yeah,
so
exactly. I have one more thing.
mhm.
I don't know if you saw this yet, but
Okay.
Trump and Putin had a phone call yesterday.
Uh-huh.
And well, first of all, real quick, I talked to Brian McDonald, who writes for RT and has lived in Russia for 9 years now. And we talked about this idea that Russia and China, are they acting as an anti-imperialist force? And he objects to that assertion a lot
Hmm.
because he says no, they are primarily have a defensive stance.
Right.
They're really not interested in being the anti-empire and all that. Although when we see things like what's unraveling and playing out in Venezuela right now, I mean, there's certainly some pushback, and also in Syria, but that's not their overall goal in his view. So,
Right.
and Trump and Putin had this phone call yesterday, and this is just 3 days after this failed coup, right? And Pompeo saying that the Russians convinced Maduro to stay. So that's like the framework here. That's the context to this. So then Trump yesterday he tweets. He said, "I had a long and very good conversation with President Putin of Russia. As I have always said, long before the witch hunt started, getting along with Russia, China, and everyone is a good thing, not a bad thing. We discussed trade, Venezuela, Ukraine, North Korea, nuclear arms control, and even the Russian hoax. Very productive talk!" Exclamation point. Now, on the Kremlin side of the phone, they published on the Kremlin website, and a paragraph about the call, and that says Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, at the initiative of the American side. So first of all, he's saying they called us, right?
Right. Hmm.
And then he says, while exchanging views on the situation around Venezuela, the president of Russia underscored, this is a paragraph, there are some things in between here.
Right.
While exchanging views on the situation around Venezuela, the president of Russia underscored that only the Venezuelans themselves have the right to determine the future of their country, whereas outside interference in the country's internal affairs and attempts to change the government in Caracas by force undermine the prospects for a political settlement of the crisis. So, quite different tones there. And it looks like they're trying to make a deal of some sort or bring people to a table or whatever. But, the giant risk of invading military intervention in Venezuela is not only, you know, the violence, the destruction, the
Hmm.
risk to everyone involved, but over here everyone's always worrying about, you know, it's going to be tough for our troops. And
Right.
that's always the number one thing. Yeah, so there's that. But um the other thing that I guess I was going to say not everyone's talking about, but I think they really are. It's the risk of triggering a war with Russia. And, we've got these flashpoints around the world, not only being on their border with our NATO troops, but, we're flying in the same airspace in Syria. And now we've got this, there are some Russian troops in Venezuela. They have, Russia and China have a lot of investment there, and they've clearly opposed intervention and
Hmm.
uh, a coup. So, there are all these ways in which a hot war with Russia could be triggered by this too. So, I mean, it's incredibly risky. We've got to get Bolton out of this mix here.
Yeah. Uh, I agree. I mean, I think that yeah, it is very dangerous because, like I said, when the United States succeeds, it tends to just leads them to it'll just lead them to want more. Like I said, Iraq. The whole idea of Iraq was to go on to Iran, and they are threatening Iran as well. So, there's a lot of, and I agree. I kind of agree that I don't think Russia and China have it as a priority to be the defenders against the United States. I don't think that's what they want. But I think that the aggressiveness of the United States, especially with the whole neocon group in there, it could force them into that posture, even though I don't think it's what they want, but I think they're going to have to push back because it's just not in their interest that to have a country behave like a lunatic like this and just try to blackmail everybody, starve everybody. You know, there's these tweets I put out where Trump's is threatening to starve Cuba if they don't back off on Venezuela, threatening Iran, bragging about how he's negotiating with Saudi Arabia to make sure that they can buffer any price consequences for his actions against Venezuela and Iran, and at the same time, then he's also vetoing the measure to try to get the United States to stop participating in a war in Yemen. So it's just this grand strategy of just death and destruction and working with guys like with Saudi Arabia, with like the worst government in the world. So you have a government like the United States acting crazy, then even if they don't want to, the Russia and China, I think, are going to have to, for their own interest, not because they're noble governments or anything, but for their own interest, they're going to say, well, we're going to have to push back. We have to, and I hope they do push back more. I hope they provide more economic. Main thing I'd like to see from, maybe some military help, but also more economic help to offset the sanctions. I'd really like to see that. Like I said, ideally it would be the internal opposition within the United States and Canada and the Europeans and everything to all this stuff going on. But unfortunately, it's not there. It's not at a level it needs to be to really roll back the sanctions. And at best, I see it maybe kicking in significantly if there's an invasion. But again, that there's so much harm they can do before they get to that point.
Yeah, exactly. And we didn't even get into the whole situation with oil. We'll have to maybe do that another time. But I think we should probably wrap up here. Okay. Anything else that you want to make before we wrap up?
Oh, I think we covered a lot of stuff here. Yeah, I just hope we'll push back. Like I appreciate you having me on. I'm glad you're getting out there and getting views out there because that's what we need to do. Is push back as much as we can. Yeah,
I'm trying. Okay. And I appreciate you, being so generous with your time for me. I really do appreciate that. Oh, and if you could tell people how to find your work and how to support you.
Yeah, well, I write for the Canary. It's an outlet based in the UK. I'm a freelance writer. I write for the Canary. They're based in the UK. And I write for, I contribute a lot recently to Venezuela Analysis, to FAIR.org. It's a great group, does media analysis. So those are the main ones I've written for recently. I've also written for Counterpunch and a few other places too.
Right. And those Venezuela Analysis, the Canary, and FAIR are doing great work on Venezuela for anybody who's not aware of that. If you're looking for if you're looking for a counter to the massive propaganda that we're getting on Venezuela right now, go to there. Particularly, they have some people on the ground, and you have people like Joe writing there. So, use that as a resource. Highly recommended. Well, thanks again, Joe, and enjoy your weekend. And I really appreciate talking to you.
Oh, no problem. Take care. Nice. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening, and a special thanks to Joe Emersberger. Follow Joe on Twitter at Rosendo_Joe, ROSENDO_JOE, and find his writing at FAIR, Venezuela Analysis, Counterpunch, the Canary, MintPress News, Telesur English, and Znet. Around the Empire is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And hey, I'd like to offer special thanks to longtime patrons and new patrons and contributors, and also thanks for the messages with suggestions and feedback. Thank you to everyone for helping me keep this going. You really do make a difference. The audio podcast, the main focus here, has been the main focus where we have the most traffic. There are a lot of ways to listen to it. Find it, subscribe on your favorite podcast app, or listen to it on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, hit the thumbs up to like the video. Leave me a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm still working on a new look, new kinds of content, including video, and I'd really like your help to build up that YouTube channel. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.